Do stay with us. We're going to continue the discussion. I'm going to invite Marianne and Jim to come on up onto the stage. Thank you, all of you, for sending in very many questions, some of which I'm about to put to our panelists. And we're also, please do sit down, Marianne and Jim. Make yourselves comfortable. And we're also going to hear from our expert panel of academics. Just put up your name tag if you want to put a question, and I shall draw you into the conversation. If you don't mind me abusing my rights as moderator, I'm going to ask the first few questions before I throw it open to everyone else. I particularly wanted to follow up with you, Marianne, as a politician. Give us your view. You represent a constituency which has a lot of indigenous people, Sami people, yes? And we know that they have been a lot of unpleasantness and a lot of concerns about onshore wind because they might lose their herding rights, etc. Perfectly understandable. How do you take local communities along with you so that it really is equitable when we bring more renewable energy to these areas?
Thank you so much for a very good question, because I think this is one of the most important things that we have to do from now on and further on. Because if we don't have the communities on the side on board, and also the reindeer herders, which has quite big part of the northern parts of Norway, where they need areas. So we have to respect, and we have to take care of and take in account that they are secured, that they could do reindeer herding in a generational perspective. And that, like for Fosen, that has been a big case in Norway, and I totally understand that, and I deeply respect the families involved, especially them. That has been really challenging. But last week we saw how the government and the reindeer herders at Sami at Fosen, they come to a solution, which I'm very happy for, because we have to learn and we have to do something different in the process from now on. Because as most people maybe know, but the Supreme Court said that this is a kind of violation of human rights, and that the licensing and expropriation decision was invalid. But now, as I said, there are a solution. And
so compromises are possible?
Yeah, I think and I believe so, and this shows that it is possible. But of course, we have to do, when it comes to case processing and new decisions, we have to take in account that we have to do things differently from now on.
So I wanted to ask a question to both Matthew and Jim, if I may. It's the same question, really. And listening to both of you, it sounds almost like you're saying the same things. We're all working together. We've got the same objectives. We've got ambitious policy, and it's supported by a lot of incentives. But you also both mentioned green jobs, high-quality jobs, jobs of the future, jobs in America, jobs in Europe. So the thing that was running through my head was, to what extent are we going to see a kind of trade wars almost in disguise, cloaked in this green mantle, and how do we avoid that? Matthew first.
Thank you very much for this excellent question. Look, I mean, trade wars serve no one's benefit. And I think we, on our side, and I think our US friends absolutely understand that. We've not always agreed on climate change. And I think that's one of the reasons that any concerns we had about the net zero, about the IRA, why it was great to see those addressed. But it was the first time we've really seen strong, united response from the US to the climate change issue. And that has been absolutely fundamental and important in terms of developing momentum globally and elsewhere. So it's in no one's interest to have those disputes. I think we've got this excellent dialogue at all levels, very friendly relationships between our governments. And we need to keep investing and keep discussing and keep, again, back to my terrible cliche, keep grinding forward on momentum. It would be very easy to slip back. Particularly in Europe now, we're seeing quite a strong backlash starting to develop from different communities who don't see their place in the green transition. The farmers have been paralyzing a number of European cities. We've got to be able to listen and to respond. There are very workable solutions in place, but again, we need to have, perhaps in the European Union, we've done a lot of the legislation, a lot of the targeting work. Now we've got to make sure these projects happen on the ground and that people can see the benefits, see those green jobs, channel the investment efforts, both public and private investment, into the future, and that will help us, I think, keep that momentum as we move forward.
But Jim McFarland, one of the ways of creating green jobs in the US and elsewhere is by attracting firms from around the world to invest in America or in Europe. That's what was underlay my question about trade wars in disguise. How do you make sure that it doesn't happen? You don't end up having a major spat with your major allies.
Well, so I want to, I guess, go back to echo a lot of things that Matthew talked about. First of all, let's recognize this is a really good problem to have, right? So we have all the countries now moving toward net zero targets, and we're making large investments in the US and in Europe to do this. So this is a better problem to have than like no one's acting or one party's acting, the other isn't. So now we've agreed, we're taking actions, we're moving in the right direction. So I would like to view this as more as like less in trade wars and more in like healthy trade skirmishes occasionally. There's a lot of rules around the WTO rules, how different countries place tariffs and things like that on different things. This is going to be political tension within the U.S. and within Europe of trying to create jobs and yet also promote, promote clean energy, promote green jobs, but then you also want to reduce emissions. And so, when you put on tariffs, again, no one wins from these things. That increases the price. That's going to lower the rate at which you're going to want to adopt these technologies. That makes it more difficult to decarbonize. So there's going to be that tension there. But I think you want to try to resolve that as best you can through the free market. Obviously, there's a lot of challenges with, rare earth elements, critical mineral supply chains. There's security risks. But I think the path forward is really one of cooperation, both with US and Europe, but then also engaging China as well in how you can carve a path forward. And believe me, to try to get the globe to net zero emissions, there's enough room for green jobs and enough room for investment so that all can really prosper on this. So I don't really think it's a concern about crowding out investment in Europe because you're investing in the US. You really need to invest everywhere and a lot more. So
okay.
I'm less concerned about that.
Okay. So a lot of questions have come in about wind power and the challenges that the offshore wind sector has been facing. It's been a terrible year, 2023. And I wanted to put a question from Erik Dahler to you, Marianne, if I may, which is really how do we meet the challenges of the high cost and the instability of offshore wind power if you're going to deliver on your ambitions?
Yeah, lately, the last couple of years, it has been a really experienced increased costs, and projects have been cancelled or put on hold, and that is quite a big challenge for all of us, not just for Norway, but for the world as a whole. But I believe that this is possible to go through that and come to a situation where both expansion, innovation, and standardization will help and scaling.
But does the government have to provide more in terms of incentives or rewrite the way the markets are framed? Does there need to be a fundamental rethink, really, to get the offshore wind sector off the ground? Sorry, terrible pardon.
I think we have to continue developing new initiatives to make sure that we succeed when it comes to offshore wind, because it is hard to start this on its own. And we already did that for Sørlige Nordsjø II. And let's see how that goes. And then I think for floating offshore wind, there will be a new situation, and we have to take in consideration.
It's not going to happen just the way things have been so far organized. I wanted to put a similar question to you, Matthew. You mentioned the importance of wind for European energy transition, but it faces a real challenge, doesn't it? Because so many wind parks are now coming to maturity. They need to be repowered. There's a lot of resistance on the ground, on the one hand. On the other hand, offshore wind is not going to come in and fill in the gap anytime soon. So what is your thinking, really, about, from a policy point of view, about what needs to be done to give the wind sector that kind of heavy lifting that it requires?
Yes, I mean, to some extent, the wind power sector is a victim of its own success. The technology is developing very fast, and the new turbines that are available to go into the market are incredibly more efficient and can generate much more electricity for each wind turbine, whether it's off or indeed onshore. Again, we recognize these challenges, which is why we came forward with the wind power package. And I think this speaks to what I was trying to say in my earlier answer about the need to work differently. We've got to work in terms of implementation packages in partnerships between government and industry and national and local stakeholders to get these things done. We know we've got issues around permitting. And we're not going to get around those by just sort of brushing these concerns away. We've got to engage with local communities, explain the benefits, again, including in terms of local energy production, which benefit autonomy and our energy security. We've got to enhance and work on the auction systems. And I'm sorry, Marianne, I was cut off when you were speaking, but I think you were talking about this point as well. We've got to, again, look at our skills and our supply chains to make sure that we stay on top of this. Wind is a key component. It's not the only component of our renewables future, but it's a key component. And we've got to work very closely, and this is my last point, with Norway. We've got to think about the regional approach. And that's why I'm very pleased to see Norway participating with us in North Sea cooperation.
We're having some troubles with the connection with Brussels. I'm sure that Matthew will join us presently. Meanwhile, let's hear from our expert panel. I believe Jay Edmonds has a question.
Yeah. Thank you to the speakers for a really excellent introduction to the conference. One of the points that was brought up by all the speakers was the challenge of the investment that has to go into place. Jim showed that we're really going to need more investment in the power sector than we've had historically. There's also investment that has to go into the end-use sectors to transform the provision of energy services from the use of fossil fuels to one that uses electric power. With all that investment going in, is there a danger of crowding out other investment and slowing overall economic growth, or not?
Spoken like an economist, Jay. Danger of crowding out.
Yeah, so the question of crowding out, I mean, empirically, it's very difficult to disentangle these things. And I think the evidence is highly mixed as to whether you actually see evidence of crowding out in these spaces. I think the early evidence, and this was in Janet Yellen's remarks on the Treasury this year on the fiscal outlook for the U.S., her statement was that we're actually seeing a lot more crowding in because of the IRA and Inflation Reduction Act. Because of the incentives, you're actually seeing a lot more investment in the private sector, and you're not really seeing decreases in other sectors. So, I mean, the early evidence would suggest that you're actually not seeing that issue. Again, the empirical evidence is kind of mixed. I think we'll just have to see where it plays out. The bigger concern, I think, right now for the investment pattern is really like interest rates at the moment. I think getting those down will make investment a lot more attractive. But with high capital cost projects, higher interest rates don't make that very favorable.
Indeed. Volker Krei.
Yeah, thanks first of all to the three speakers for very inspiring speeches. All three of you focused on investments and action to reduce territorial emissions in your countries or regions. At the same time, we know that for Norway, the EU and the US, so-called consumption-based emissions are actually significantly higher than the territorial-based emissions, simply because we are importing goods that basically come with emissions that occur outside of our countries. In the EU, we have the cross-border adjustment, the carbon border adjustment mechanism coming up, going sharp in roughly 2 years, currently in a test phase. But I was wondering more broadly, what are measures currently in discussion or basically targeting these consumption-based emissions that in the end we are, at least to a good extent, ourselves also responsible for and need to do something about.
Marianne.
I'm sorry, I'm not quite sure if I catch up the question totally.
If I got it right, it's about really what can we do to use less energy, consumption-based, reduce
energy.
Demand, yes? Is that what the question about? No. Go on, Volker.
Well, I was actually more referring to emissions embodied in products that we are importing. For example, food production occurring outside the EU, but we are importing those. So we don't have direct control over the emissions because they occur outside the country, but still, in my view, belong to our responsibility to some degree because we are consuming or demanding these services and goods.
Marianne.
Yeah, I think we have to develop and be aware of that, as you say, we import things, food, etc., that has emissions included. So to just, for Norway, I think it's important to have this budget of what we are using and how we are planning for the future when it comes to emissions. And actually the government has developed a green book, as you can call it. They deliver it every year, annual, together with the budget, just to show how much emissions our politics actually will mean for Norway. And then, of course, as it is like now, we will have an agreement internationally that every country is responsible for its own production and use. But of course, we have to take in consideration that when we import things, there has some consequences, and we have to make sure that we do things in a smarter way in the future.
Yeah. Oh, we've got Matthew Baldwin back with us. Did you hear the question? I'm not sure whether you...
I'm very sorry. No, I've had terrible computer problems this morning. I lost myself when I was just finishing my last remarks, and I haven't heard the question or what Marianne said, so sorry.
So it was really a question from Volker Krei, one of our panelists, about how one takes into account the fact that Europe, the US too, has exported a lot of its emissions because, after all, many manufactured goods come from far away. And of course, the carbon border adjustment mechanism is now in place. But to what extent is that really addressing the issue that we're not really tackling those emissions ourselves adequately? Or is the CBAM doing the trick, in your opinion?
Well, I think...
If I could just weigh in here on a few points. In the U.S., one of the provisions of the Inflation Reduction Act talked about sort of embodied carbon and using the federal government as a way to buy and purchase lower carbon products, so cement and other things like that. So that's one way, using purchasing power within the country to develop lower carbon products. Two, with respect to CBAM measures, like there's a lot of acts in Congress right now that are being considered, or bills in Congress that are being considered to address similar topics around placing, border carbon adjustments on, steel industry is the one that's come up, but there's other like heavy industry that's also coming up. At a third level, so we can talk through border carbon adjustment measures, and again, like that can also escalate and lead to trade wars, so you want to be careful with that. So, but I think the broader point would be is you also really want to promote lowering the cost of clean energy technologies, and that's what the European program and the US program is really trying to do. You're trying to build scale and infrastructure to lower the cost of these technologies so that the rest of the world can adopt them, and then that, again, would kind of lower the emissions that you're importing because other countries are meeting their targets.
Matthew.
Yeah, very quickly, and I can be brief because I agree with Jim. Look, I mean, the CBAM is a necessary transitioning tool because we are a continent with many close neighbors. And it's essential if we're going to avoid this decarbonizing at home and having our industries completely destroyed. If we can play the CBAM right, and I think we can help that green transition in the neighborhood, exactly as Jim's saying, by promoting the take-up and the cost of green technologies. And again, this speaks to the point I made earlier about helping our neighboring countries themselves in their green transition. These are the jobs of the future. They don't want to be locked into a declining market for fossil fuels, but we need to help them. We can't assume that they'll be able to make that transition alone, and that's why our partnerships with our neighborhood are so essential in terms of, I think, developing a green transition in the neighborhood and beyond.
Matthew Baldwin, Jim McFarland, Marianne Sivertsen Næss, thank you so very much. I'm afraid we're out of time. This conversation could roll on and on and on. And thank you to everyone for sending in some brilliant questions, including some tricky ones about the upcoming effect of a US election, which Jim has happily swerved. Thank you.